Good morning and welcome to everybody to the third installment of the Springfield Day for the Southeast Research Farm, the Southeast Research Farm at Crawfordsville, Iowa. On behalf of the staff and faculty of Iowa State and on behalf of the board members of the association, I do extend greetings to all of you here. Just to give a few housekeeping items. During the program, if you have some questions, there is a Q&A box that should be showing up on your bar. If it does at the bottom of the screen, perhaps at the top, depending upon what browser you're using and so forth there. You may need to click on the three dots in a row in order to bring that up. But there's a Q&A box, and so if you have some questions for Dr. Darr, please put them in. We may respond to you by just responding right back to you directly there. We may end up addressing those to the entire group. We may answer those just verbally for everybody here. So kind of depending upon what we've got going. Historically, in the first two sessions of these, we've simply broadcast the question out and then answered it. So use the question and answer box for that. Also, there is a chat box that's there, and that is, we will from time to time perhaps put links there that you can use to increase your learning and so forth, or perhaps to send something out to everybody that is in attendance here. If you are a certified crop advisor and during the registration process did not put your information in, do put that in the chat box. We will be sure that you do get credit for that. As I indicated, this is brought to you by a number of people here. First of all, the field extension people that are involved in this are shown here. Ryan Droletti is one of the two farm management specialists that relates to the Southeast Research Farm. He also acts as the treasurer for the association. Myron Reese and Cody Snyder are co-managers of the Southeast Research Farm, and Dominic Snyder from the Muscatine Farm helps them a lot at Southeast, and likewise they go a lot over to Muscatine. They're basically a team that works together, and they work together very, very well. Chet Hesseltine is also part of that group, and I did not mean to slight him. We have three field agronomists on here that relate to the farm. Josh Mickle in the top center. My ugly mug is in the dead center. So those of you that are playing darts, you can just aim for me, and that'll get you the highest number of points. And then Rebecca Vitito in the lower right. Also, Christina Tabakhorst, who is the ag engineer that relates to the farm, is with us also here. And we're the ones that try to make this happen at least. The other thing I did mention is the board members. The farm is actually owned by the local people. It's operated by Iowa State. And then the two groups together co-manage, the farm in terms of what activities are going to be occurring there. The list of board members, there's one board member from each county that relates to the farm. We have 21 counties, and so you can see who your local board member is there. Again, Dwayne Jordan, the president from Lynn County, Alan Mather from Cedar County, the vice president. Ryan, as I mentioned before, is the treasurer of the association, and then I act as the secretary here. Today's program is approved, again, as I mentioned earlier, for CCA credits, and so again, do get that in the chat box, your number, if you did not submit that in as a part of your registration. And with that, it is my pleasure now to turn this over to Matt Darr for today's topics here, which is late season field scouting with UAVs. Matt is an extension agricultural engineer. If you look on the computer, look him up there, you'll find that he is 25% teaching and 75% research, and we in extension steal him a little bit from time to time, and we've stolen some of his time this year. His interest is in technology and also in biorenewables and kind of interfacing those. Matt is the what I'll call the head honcho at the Biocentury farm, if you're familiar with that, between Ames and Boone. It's just across the street to the west from the Agricultural Engineering and Agronomy Research Farm. As I do turn it over to Mike or Matt, I do want to point out that this is indeed the third installment. There'll be another installment of the field day tomorrow morning at 8:30. All of these are being put on our YouTube channel, as you may have seen through the scrolling. And the first two are already up there. This will be up there later today. And then the one tomorrow with Prashant Jha will be up there after tomorrow here. This is the QR code. Also the URL if you want to go to the YouTube channel and look at something you've missed, to review it and so forth. And we will put that link at the bottom there. We will put that in the chat box here. And with that, I am going to drop out and stop sharing my screen. And it is with great pleasure that I turn this over to Matt Darr. Matt?
Great, thanks, Virgil. All right, so it's my pleasure to be with everybody today and talk a little about imagery and the use of imagery for scouting. And I'm going to kind of extend this a little bit farther than just late season and talk about mid to late season. So essentially from about this date forward throughout harvest. So a couple goals or topics I'm going to hit on today. I am going to cover a little bit about the basics of remote sensing and why we use imagery in agriculture. Then I'm going to go over what I'll say are several pretty typical uses of imagery in terms of mid and late season applications. And then I'll kind of wrap it up with some tips around, if you want to get started, what are some early things that you can do. I do want to preface this. When we talk about imagery, we get a lot of questions about, what can we do with it right now, right? What problem does it solve, immediately today? And of course, like many things in agriculture, it's usually not that easy. And imagery has proven itself to be a really valuable source of information to both root cause current problems and help us think about how to prevent those into the future. But there's not that many things that imagery can reverse, right? Usually it's a matter of getting new insight into our crop production systems, hopefully maybe limiting the additional economic impact in a single year, and then putting in place mechanisms or thinking about different practices that allow you to eliminate those types of, negative losses in future years. And I often refer to this as the treadmill effect. I was thinking about putting a poll up on how many of us had dusty treadmills in our basements, but it has a similar sort of application where, just because we buy imagery, right, and this is true for most data in agriculture, just because we access it doesn't mean it's valuable. It's only how we use it. And our use of that information, both in season and then beyond, how we plan for future years, is really the key way that we drive value from this information. So to get started, just a real quick refresher on what imagery is in agriculture. Of course, every physical surface reflects light and absorbs light. So I have a red shirt on today, and it looks red because this particular material reflects the color red from the color spectrum of light in the room, and our eyes can perceive that as being a reflected color. Plants, of course, reflect green. That's why they when they're healthy, at least, they look very green. So we can use this light reflection as a signal to us, a signal for the plant health, usually the plant vigor, and sometimes use it to tell more specific things about potentially how the plant's feeling or the health level. What's unique about plants is that in addition to the colors that we can see very commonly with our eyes, plants also reflect colors that we can't see. And this would be similar to a dog that can hear things that we can't hear. And one of the most common sources of light that a plant will reflect very well that we can't see is we call near infrared. It's sort of on the far end of the reds and purples in the color spectrum. And near infrared is a color that when plants are feeling unhealthy or have nutrient deficiencies, really changes quite a bit in terms of how much near infrared light they reflect. And so the whole topic of remote sensing or using cameras to take pictures has been driven by the fact that we want to plants are able to reflect differences in this light. So I want to show you a quick example of what I mean by that. And this is a very typical field image of a color image, red and green, blue, RGB image. This would be an image you could take as you flew into an airport or put a drone up over top of a field. And as we look at the particular image, we can pick out things like there's some ponded areas in the field. It was a little wet spring. We can see some tire traffic on the headlands where the side dress applicator turned around. But in general, I think most of the field, tends to look like it's fairly consistent and has a pretty strong canopy and vegetation. If we take the same picture though, and we look at it in the infrared spectrum, we really get a little different story on what the plants are telling us. And in this case, it's I think a really good example of how certain types of imagery can present sensitive features that we simply can't see with our natural eyes. And you can see everything from some spots where looks like there's some crop damage, and that was associated with the side dress pass through the field where it ran over a little bit of crop. You can see issues of kind of streaking throughout the field where we probably had too much weight on a planter potentially and had some compaction associated with that. And then certainly the vigor across the field or the kind of the vegetative biomass is very different, right? And in the case of making directive decisions in the future years, our goal would be to use imagery to really confirm that we've got consistent vegetation and consistent plant growth across the field, right? If there's not consistent plant growth, then we will hope it's being driven by something that's soil, water, biologically driven. If there's any sort of straight lines, then we know that we did that. That was our limiting delivery of the crop production system. Okay, so side by side again, you can kind of see the differences here, and what's important to note is as you go to different levels of imagery, you're going to unlock different levels of insight. For example, the type of color spectrums that we're looking at. So why have drones become and UAVs become so popular recently? Well, there's in my opinion, there's a couple real driving factors. First and foremost is they're really fairly affordable. You can get a high quality ag scouting drone for under $1,000 that will last for several years. So if you're doing any level of scouting, having the ability to quickly get up in the air, get a different perspective of the field, and quickly direct your on-ground efforts or even your UAV scouting efforts into the areas of highest need, highest demand, is a huge value add. And that's why I believe we've seen such a strong adoption rate of UAVs in particular within the ag applications. And frankly, getting an aero image just gives you a new perspective on the ability to measure canopy fill and crop growth in a way that highlights differences that are pretty difficult to see with a naked eye. Now, when we think about scouting with UAVs, we really think about two different types of ways we can do this. The first is to actually map the whole field. That's shown on the left. And in this case, with the UAV, we would be flying the entire field in basically a grid pattern. So we would pick tram lines across the field and go back and forth. It might take us an hour or two to fly a full field. We probably have to change batteries a few times to do that. But that will produce an imagery map, a map that we can zoom into, a map that we can navigate to locations and use, similar to how we would use a yield map or a soil fertility map. On the right is what we call a scouting image. And the scouting image is purely a picture, right? It's a perspective of the field that is giving us some direction on where to go next, where to go scout, what kind of problems we have, what kind of fertility issues or soil issues we're fighting in a given year. But it's not a map. It's not going to allow us to go back and re-navigate to a spot or overlay it with yield data, for example. Now, I think, in my opinion, the 80-20 rule here is that many of our applications in agriculture are achieved, our goals are achieved with purely using these scouting images, right? And this involves, just putting a UAV in the air, and within, 5, 10, 15 minutes, you're able to fly around the field and get these type of perspective images to assess crop health very quickly. When we think about the full mapping, to try to map the whole field, there is several additional requirements. We've got to pre-plan the flight. We've got to do it in a deliberate pattern. We often have to upload the data to a cloud service in order to turn that into a map. So there's a different level of complexity, and my recommendation to producers is always starting with the right side. Start with scouting pictures. Start with the easy button, and start to understand what type of variability you can see in your fields that wasn't that never presented itself when doing typical ground scouting or other manual scouting practices. All right, so I want to go through several examples, and I've got these labeled as kind of tips, but they're just kind of a quick view of a bunch of different ways that scouting mid to late season can add value. And for me, this really means like post canopy. So there's a whole nother set of opportunities in plant emergence and early season weed detection, but here we're talking really canopy and beyond. So number one is nutrient deficiency. And in fact, the background picture I'm using here, you can hopefully perceive the yellow stripes that are spread across this field. And this is a very typical type of issue where we had nitrogen applied with in a urea top dress application, and the applicator in this case was running a 90-foot spread pattern, but the fertilizer was only making it 80 feet wide, and so they were left with a 10-foot area at the ends of each pass, the edges of the pass, where they had essentially unfertilized crop. These issues, right, would never show up in a yield map, because our yield map is taking 6 or 8 or 12 rows together and bunching that into one data point. So UAVs and the use of UAVs for scouting is really one of the only ways that we can get in and assess the effectiveness of nutrient deficiency. In fact, in the last 3 years, through Iowa State, we've received more calls from the insurance industry and the ag retail fertilizer industry on how to deal with this rising number of claims around problems with nutrient distribution. And by and large, it's not that there's a new problem. It's that UAVs are giving us the tools to do a better job now of assessing quality and determining if there was any deficiency issues. Right? These are a couple examples from a mapped view where we have kind of a whole field view, and course, the one on the left is pretty extreme. That was a really wet year, so you can see a lot of nutrient deficiency, water stress in areas that are sort of aligned with where we expect water to flow. You also notice on the left, there seems to be this sort of vertical striping pattern, okay? And I intentionally threw this photo in because that vertical pattern is very indicative of having a split planter or two hybrids in a field. And just like we all have unique complexions, so do crops. And each hybrid is going to reflect light a little bit differently. And so it's pretty normal to see that when you've got multiple hybrids in a field. Over on the right is, this was an issue with anhydrous, where the tank went out and we didn't quite get in the right spot when the next tank got hooked on and started to go. And of course, if we catch this early enough, we can't recover the total yield potential in that area, but we can minimize what our total loss is. So we can't get it all back, but we can limit how much the total impact is. Another couple examples here. Again, this happens to have a pipeline through the field, but more examples of the ability to do quick scouting and see where you've got some fertility issues. I really like this photo. This shows, of course, the pipeline's right through the middle of this, but you can see, you know, ignore the pipeline, you can start to see there's variability as I work up the landscape here between the greenness of that crop. And to me, again, that's a line, right? That's something that we did as part of the crop production system. And for elite crop production, you know, evaluating this in a detailed way and taking the necessary measures to ensure it doesn't happen again is really a differentiating factor in high job quality crop production. And then this is more of, I stole this off Twitter, so I can't say much of the background here, but you know, even clearly you can see some of the extreme cases where you know, there was just a complete failure of the distribution system there, and you know, it did a really good job of spreading fertilizer in about 3 rows. And even late season. So this is a similar situation of fertilizer pattern issues, and even late season, we're able to pick that up and see it as well with the vegetation and dry down of the crop. And these are, again, these type of images are commonly used to deal with not only making improvements to the next year, but in some cases, insurance claims with retailers and application. Okay, number 2, residue movement. So one of the nice things about UAVs is if you get up and take an aerial shot and you see, man, I've got some stand issues in certain parts of the field, you're able to really zoom in. This is all from a UAV. Zoom in and get a better picture of what's actually going on. So you can start to drive towards, you know, if I'm doing tillage, maybe I'm doing too much tillage. Maybe I'm not pinning the residue enough. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I need to think about waterways in strategic areas to prevent some of this soil and residue movement from limiting yields. Again, driving the data piece into the insight into what to do next year. Tire traffic. I've said many times publicly that I've never seen a picture of a field that didn't have some level of tire traffic in it. With imagery, if you take imagery around, at least in corn, right before canopy, you get into like the V10 stage, and likewise right before tassel, the corn becomes very descriptive about what's happening to it. And so you can see some diagonal patterns across the field. You know, those are associated with tillage passes that happened in the spring prior to planting, and it can start to help you again assess what your overall job quality is, and if there's things you should be changing in order to maximize yield potential through tire packages or equipment configurations. Okay, just another example of this again. On the left, using the UAV to go in and find these areas where we've got compaction issues, and then some ground truthing on the right. And this one is a very similar view, except this time we're using a near infrared image. So you see more of a reddish image with plant vigor. And we have routinely done ground truthing to confirm these differences in plant vigor do end up being swings in yield. And we've yet to be in a field where we haven't had a direct correlation to, as you would expect, bigger, healthier plants yield more grain. And Imagery can tell us that on a row by row basis. Number 4 is weeds. So UAVs are great for getting out and looking at late season weed escapes or post application herbicide effectiveness. They're great for understanding where you've got potentially a breakout of some resistance weeds or problems that you may want to take care of in a special way. To prevent a future really challenging type of situation. Number 5 is crop damage, and I've had a number of folks tell me that they paid for their UAV purely based on their first time they dealt with wind or hail damage. But if you've ever gone out and tried to manually walk a cornfield and assess percentage of crop damage, or got up on the back of a truck and tried to estimate it, UAVs are just a perfect solution, technical solution, to get up in the air and really assess how severe the crop damage is, and whether it's what magnitude of claim that you potentially have. That works not only during the growing part of the season, but also if it's late season. You can get a feel for how much whether you need a reel on your combine head. Right, how much of an issue this is in your fields, and again, in a matter of minutes to get this level of insight. Number 6 is water management and drainage. So on the right year, we haven't had a super wet year this year, but on a wetter year, you can really get a great picture of the effectiveness of your tile system, not only where it's working, but also where it's potentially not working very well, or where you need to add more capacity into the drainage network. And likewise, another look, but again, from in terms of estimating total ponding and water management, these are great tools. And lastly, this is a video. I'm gonna pause it a few places, but one of the last places that we use imagery for quite a bit is to assess dry down and be thoughtful of the route that we're going to harvest soybeans in particular. So about a week before soybean harvest, we will commonly go out and just get a bird's eye view of the fields to really understand which fields are drying down at which rate, and this has a direct financial advantage, particularly if you're storing that grain and you're trying to preserve the right moisture content in there to make sure that you're not not harvesting soybeans at 9%. Okay, so I want to leave you with just a few tips on some best practices, and we'll open up for questions. A couple things up front. You need to decide if you're going to do this yourself or if you're going to hire somebody to do it. I usually recommend folks it's best to date before you get married. So ask your ag retailer, your crop consultant, your seed dealer. Ask. Most of them have access to or themselves have UAVs, and that's a great way to get started. Let them come out and do a flight for you. Certainly encourage you to be legal. You need to make sure that you're thoughtful of how you're flying, where you're flying, and that you're preventing any issues with flying over houses or high traffic areas, all those sort of things that can become problematic. And then lastly, the last bullet point left is really critical, right? You should expect knowledge out of imagery, not necessarily solutions. It's very much like yield data, where you need to be thoughtful of this information as a way to lead you forward, but it's not going to tell you the exact answer, right? It's an additional tool to help continue to increase the effectiveness of your production system, identify areas where you've got opportunities. Okay, with that, I'm happy to open it up for questions, and And thanks again for the time this morning.
Matt, thank you very much. We appreciate that. We do have a question in the Q&A section. The question is it worth spending 2 to 3 times more money on an NIR NDVI sensor over the usual RGB? Some companies are saying yes to go that route, of course, and the Drone Deploy is saying stick with the RGB. They've got a journal article showing they can make crop health maps that are just as good.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it really depends on what you want to do. I always, again, I recommend to folks, you want to start basic here, in my opinion. So I'm a huge fan of using an RGB camera, just taking scouting pictures, and I think that fits the bill for 80+% of producers, right? I think when you start talking about mapping with NDVI or NIR imagery, you can get more information, and we use it routinely in research applications because it is very sensitive and very powerful. But you sort of have to be at a higher level on the knowledge curve on how to apply that and what that information means. And particularly in the world of drones, it seems like we're back in 2004 with precision ag, where every 2 years there was some brand new display that came out that we had to buy. And cameras are a little bit like that right now, right? So the NIR cameras, I don't think we've really stabilized. So you end up spending a few grand for a camera, and the next year it's the wrong camera, right? And so it depends on where you want to be on the adoption curve, but I think again, 80-20 rule says that most producers would get a lot of early knowledge just by doing a more effective job of scouting with color imagery.
Okay, thank you, Matt. You mentioned that we can purchase imagery, or we can have like the drones and so forth here, and you talked about the RGB. Do you see any potential for the merging of those two? And I guess I'm saying that maybe a farmer would have a drone with an RGB camera, but would also maybe contract some flights that would pull up some of the NIR imagery and so forth. Would there be any value in that, do you think?
That's I do think there is. I think what we're seeing in the industry is you've got 3 levels of how we get imagery. We've got UAVs at a very high resolution plant by plant basis. We've got planes that we fly that get us a row by row picture, essentially. And then we've got satellites. And I think the interesting thing in the industry is that satellites are getting better and better. And we're getting to the point where satellites have imagery that is effectively giving us a row by row signature on plant vigor, including NIR data. Now it's got to be sunny, right? They can't see through clouds, and there's timing issues with that. But there are companies now that are imaging the entire planet, every square foot of the planet, on a sub-meter resolution daily, every single day. And so I think in agriculture, that when we think about looking at crop health changes over time, I think that's going to be ultimately where this shakes out. And drones continue to be the go-to for driving to the field, scouting, and getting that instant feedback, instant direction on our crop production system.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions from the group? Okay, well, hearing none, I think we will go ahead and conclude at this time. I know Matt would be very happy to respond to email questions and so forth here on down the road here. If you have any, again, if you would like to review what has happened here, this will be on the YouTube channel. Rebecca put the link up here just a little bit ago, so you can just click on that. You'll find the channel. You can save that to your favorite browser, and then come back tomorrow to that channel and his presentation will be up there. Also, again, I would like to remind you that if you are a CCA and did not get your number in on the registration, do put it in the chat box. We will get your credit for that. We will have the final installment of the Springfield Day tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. with Prashant Jha, who is, shall I just say, the new improved Mike Owen. And he was sticking a knife in my back if you heard me say that, but that's okay. Prashant was going to be, addressing, some of the weed resistance management issues that we're seeing. So I think without further ado, have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much for attending.